Interpretations of Section 230 have allowed big tech to escape accountability for questionable posts on their platform by users. But last week, the Texas Supreme Court ruled, quote, Facebook can be held liable for state civil claims of sex trafficking on its platform.
Joining us now to discuss is Senior Director of Policy at the Conservative Partnership Institute, Rachel Bovard. Rachel, what are the implications of this decision?
Well, it's a pretty tremendous decision. If you look at the body of jurisprudence around Section 230, it all goes one way. And that is to say, it says big tech is liable for absolutely nothing. And what was interesting about this decision is that the judge acknowledged that. He said, yes, the federal claims that are being brought by the plaintiffs for negligence, for product liability, I can't, do anything about that. The jurisprudence is what it is. But on these state claims, he said amendments that were passed by Congress in 2018 to Section 230 allow those claims to go forward. And this is a big deal because for a long time, these platforms have, shed any responsibility and claimed in court multiple times that they are not responsible for really horrific cases of sex trafficking, like you saw in this case, which were 14 and 15-year-old girls trafficked into sex slavery using Instagram, to the point where when one of the girls was rescued from that situation, her profile was still being used to lure other girls into the same situation. The mother contacted Facebook multiple times to no response. That's how comfortable these companies have become with their liability shield.
So what is it about those amendments that the judge ruled enabled them to treat these state claims differently? What is it about those amendments that make the difference?
Well, if you remember back in 2018, all of this centered around the case of Backpage.com and Backpage's role in knowingly facilitating the sex trafficking of minors. And so those amendments were, FOSTA, SESTA is sort of how you hear them referred to colloquially, but really had to do with sort of getting at this idea of holding the platforms liable for this kind of behavior. Now, there's, all kinds of claims that, those laws weren't effective, that they've actually had negative effects on things like legal prostitution, putting women in danger, and that's up for debate. But I think what is clear is that it was a well-meaning attempt, a genuine attempt, I think, by Congress to get at what is a pervasive problem. And the judge recognized that. And the judge also recognized the fact that, it's entirely possible that all of this Section 230 jurisprudence, which, again, took a pretty porous liability shield and is stretched it into this bulletproof liability shield, that may be wrong. He hat-tipped to Justice Clarence Thomas, relied on a number of amicus briefs that were filed that said, hey, maybe the courts have gotten it wrong, but ultimately, if they have, Congress is the one that has to act here. The courts can't do it themselves.
Rachel, maybe I haven't looked closely enough, but my understanding of the research is that it's pretty unequivocal that there has been an uptick in violence suffered by sex workers who no longer have the ability to use Backpage to filter future potential clients and instead are pushed into the physical spaces which are much riskier. Is there some equivocation in the research?
So there has been work done here. I think a lot of people are like, well, who is it funded by and where is that coming from? But I think those claims are reasonable, right? I think anytime you take something that was on a public platform, it's still happening, but now it's happening in the shadows, of course, it's going to be more dangerous. So I don't write those claims off exclusively. But I think, if Congress wants to fix this problem, the fact that they didn't get it right the first time isn't a barrier for them from acting again. And I think that's what you'd love to see, or is Congress to fix this problem. If they didn't get it right the first time, they should act to fix it now. And I would argue fix it across a broader segment of areas, because it's not just sex trafficking you see on these platforms. You see, egregious harassment. You see terrorism claims, incitement, all these things, that flourish online. The platforms don't have to do anything about because they're, legally held not, immune from any responsibility. So they don't even try.
Rachel, I feel like you do so much work on Section 230 that you must just see it in your dreams, just like Section 230, going across your mind's eye. But the question I wanted to ask you is precisely about, this is something you talk about a lot, and this example I think is illustrative of it. Section 230 is kind of a tiny part of the problem, right? Section 230, repealing Section 230 could do some stuff, but this is all downstream of issues that can't be dealt with by Section 230 alone, right?
That's absolutely right. I think, it's a part of the problem, right? And I think Republicans and conservatives especially love to get wrapped around this axle of Section 230 because of claims of conservative censorship. And they think that if we address Section 230, then we're going to make all those problems go away. And that's just not the case, right? It's a small part of a much bigger solution that I think is actually downstream of market power. And I've written about this a lot, but I do think, enforcing our antitrust laws and really dealing with that economic dominance, then, you get to a point where if you break that, you can compete some of these speech concerns away. You put companies in a much more accountable position when they're actually competing in the market, when they're held accountable for behavior like this. Right now, they have no competitors. They don't feel accountable for anything. And that's why you see, I think, this arrogance and this just sort of disdain for really clear acts of, grotesque violence and trafficking that happen on their platforms.
But Rachel, why wouldn't the repealing Section 230 actually make the censorship question worse? And would it it also seems like if you're Yelp, for instance, and you host user-generated comments about a restaurant, and you can be sued into oblivion if for any particular comment that somebody makes about any particular restaurant. There's just no way at scale for them to fact check everybody's claim that they saw a rat running through the kitchen. Doesn't it make the censorship problem worse, and doesn't it undermine kind of the basis of the internet?
Yeah, to repeal Section 230 would no doubt, I think, change the way the internet ecosystem functions. I think that's without question. I do think, I take issue with a little bit of the sky is falling hysterical rhetoric that, the internet would break without Section 230. But to your point, there's websites across the internet rely on it. Comment sections in newspapers rely on it. So I do think that some form of Section 230 is warranted. Would the internet completely break if it was gone? No. I mean, these platforms operate overseas in Europe without any kind of Section 230 equivalent, and they've managed it okay. Now, of course, the laws are different over there, particularly for certain forms of speech. But what would happen is a tort system would develop, right? The courts would actually have to step in and do a lot of work here to tell us what is, allowable online and what is not. Is that an ideal universe? Probably not. But I do think that you're going to see a lot of people push toward a reform because they say, look, what is happening now is not what Congress originally intended. The courts have just bloated this tiny provision of law into this massive bulletproof immunity that was never intended. So I do think you're seeing people say, look, if we need to repeal to incentivize reform, fine, but ultimately reform is the goal here because nobody wants the situation that you just described, which, has a possibility of playing out if this isn't done correctly.
Well, Rachel, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks, guys.
And we'll have more Rising for you right after this.